Underneath the triple tree, there is a man who waits for me. And should I go or should I stay, my fate's the same, either way. Borrasca, aka The Place Where Bad Things Happen, is a creepypasta that was written by C.K. Walker, and honestly, I feel like calling it a creepypasta is like spitting in its face. It's an insult almost, because it's so much more than that. It transcends a creepypasta and is just overall a beautifully written, horrific tale. It's one of those stories that you're definitely going to want to read underneath your covers for protection. May even make you piss your pants a bit. And I love it so much that I just wanted to talk about it today. So to set the scene for you, Borrasca takes place in a small revitalized mining town called Drisking, Missouri, which, side note, sounds eerily similar to the small town that I grew up in, where like everybody knows everybody, that kind of thing. Just the general details they were giving were eerily similar to what I was already very familiar growing up with. Except the big difference is that we didn't have people that went missing every single year. That's a big thing that makes Drisking different. Pretty much every year, a handful of people go missing and they're never found. And as you go through the story, you find out that that is something that the people have just become complacent with. It's something that they just accept and is a part of their daily life. And I'll get more into that later after I explain everything to you. I don't want to hit you with a massive spoiler alert at the main beginning of the video. I want to take you through the journey so you can also kind of get the idea of my experience with this story. So now that I've kind of set the setting for you, we can go ahead and hop into the story and talk about it from the beginning, from Borrasca number 1, because this story is laid out in 5 different parts, how she uploaded it on her website, Borrasca's 1 through 5. And the opening line of the story pretty much gives you a good idea of what's about to happen. It says it's a long story, but one you've never heard before. This story is about a place that dwells on the mountain, a place where bad things happen. And you may think you know about the bad things. You may decide you have it all figured out, but you don't. Because the truth is worse than monsters or men. And then we get introduced to our main cast of characters here, mainly just our protagonist, Sam Walker, as him and his family are in the process of moving to this new town called Drisking, Missouri. You got Sam, his sister Whitney, his mom Elizabeth, and then his dad Graham. And the reason they're moving here in the first place kind of gets glossed over. It's kind of just like an afterthought. It feels like something to set up the story, but as we go through, the foreshadowing is absolutely insane. It says right here, I secretly blame my dad as well. I'd heard the whispers too. My dad had done something wrong, something bad, and the sheriff's department had reassigned him to some little out-of-the-way county to save face. My parents didn't want me to know that, but I did. And I want you to keep in mind these foreshadowing bits that I bring up. Once again, I don't want to spoil anything for you from the beginning, but the foreshadowing and the insight that you get reading this the second time through, the understanding you have after you know the story, lines like this stick out like a sore thumb. It's like playing with those children's toys where you put the shape into the shaped hole. That's what it feels like once you read through these lines. It just all connects and all makes sense so perfectly. But as they are in the process of moving, Whitney is 14 years old and Sam is only 9. So Sam hasn't really had any strong connections in Chicago where they're from. So he's kind of excited to start fresh, start new in a new place. It sounds like an adventure to him. But Whitney, she's the complete opposite. She doesn't want a new house. She doesn't want new friends. She wants her old life and her current boyfriend, Jay, and all this kind of stuff. She just, typical teenage girl. Typical teenager, really. They don't want change. But they don't really have a choice because, their parents are moving, so they kind of have to. So they end up pulling up to Drisking. They go to their new house and they start unloading all of their stuff. And this is where they run into their neighbors, which is the Landy family. And Sam is introduced to their son, who is the same age as him. He's a little bit older, and his name is Kyle Landy. They're going to be going into the 7th grade together. They're in the same grade, and then they end up meeting one of Kyle's friends, Kimber DeStaro, and they form this little ragtag trio that we follow throughout the rest of the story. There are 3 main protagonists. They're the ones that we're going to be rooting for, and honestly, they're a very likable group of characters. They're written very well. And then it says on the last Saturday before school started, Kyle and Kimber told Sam they were going to take him somewhere special called the Triple Tree. And the Triple Tree is a pretty crucial central point of this story. It's brought up a whole lot in terms of the whole Borrasca narrative. And in the story, they have this conversation back and forth of Sam asking what it is, and then they explain to him that it's a giant treehouse that's out in the woods. So then they go to take him there and say that it's going to be this like big surprise, and he has to do a special ceremony since he's a first timer. So then they make it to the Triple Tree, and they explain to Sam that the ceremony that first timers have to do is they have to take a knife and carve their name into the Triple Tree, or else they'll disappear and die. And then the second part of the ritual is that after you carve your name, you have to say the rhyme, which is what I said at the beginning of this video. Underneath the Triple Tree, there is a man who waits for me, and should I go or should I stay, my fate's the same either way. So the setup so far is leading you to believe that there is some supernatural elements going on here, or at least, at the very least, a monster out in these woods that may be waiting to attack these kids or something. But once you figure out the true colors of this story, monsters would have almost been comforting. But not to get sidetracked too far, they do the whole ritual thing, and then they go into the treehouse to where they have Miller Lights stashed there, and they all start drinking them, having a good old time, just, you know, having fun as 9 and 10-year-olds would, drinking alcohol. And then while they're in the middle of having their grand old time, it says in the story here, Kimber was in the middle of reciting the alphabet backwards when a loud metallic grinding suddenly pierced the calm mountain air like a gunshot. And then once the sound finally dissipated, Sam asked what that was, and he says, "Do you guys know?" because no one really answered him, and they act like it was just kind of something that happened. They didn't really react in the same way he did. And then Kyle said, "It's nothing. We hear it sometimes in town. It's not a big deal. It's just louder up here." And then he asked, but what's making that sound?" "Borrasca," Kimber whispered without taking her eyes off her feet. And then they get into this whole discussion of what Borrasca is. He asks who it is, and they say it's not who, it's where, it's a place. And then he asks if it's another town. They say no, it's just a place in the woods. "Bad things happen there," Kimber said more to herself than me. "Like what?" "Bad things," Kimber repeated. And then he tries to get an elaboration on what these bad things are, but they don't elaborate any further. They just kind of switch the subject and say, "We better go home." You know, they just kind of cut him off, try to switch the topic matter and move on to something else. But he does get an answer after he asks who lives in Borrasca by Kyle's little brother Parker responding and saying the skinned men live there. But Kyle laughs at that and says only babies believe in the skinned men. And then we skip to Sam's first day at Drisking Middle, where they're giving a presentation, which apparently happens every single year, and it's usually Tom Prescott that gives the speech, but today, for some reason, it's Jimmy Prescott, which is Tom's son. And the Prescotts, by the way, I haven't explained this yet, but the Prescotts are like the rich family in Drisking. They're the ones who revitalized it after all the mines shut down and were imploded and everything went to shambles. The town pretty much went bankrupt. Nobody had money. Everyone started leaving, but the Prescotts decided to stay, stick it out, and they revitalized the town, making it to the thriving, postcard-esque image that it was currently. And it's here when we're first introduced to Jimmy when Kimber says, "I don't like Jimmy Prescott." Kimber shook her head. "He gives me the heebie-jeebies. His dad is so much nicer. He's like a grandpa." And I just wanted to point that specific line out because, once again, foreshadowing. The second read-through gives you a bit of insight into that line. And I'm going to keep pointing lines out like that because once I do finally explain everything to you, you can go back and see them yourselves and just see how much more impactful those things really are once you know what's going on. But then after that presentation, Sam is in class whenever his teacher gets a phone call from the front office, and he can tell something bad is going on. He can tell something's wrong, but he doesn't exactly know what. But then they say someone's there to pick him up, to which they come pick him up and take him to his house, where he sees that there's several police cars out front of his house, and he's trying to desperately figure out what's going on. And then when he goes in, he asks his mom if something happened to his dad, to which she says no, his dad is fine. And then he says, "Then what happened?" To which his mom says, Whitney never made it to school this morning. And then Sam tries to explain that he thinks he's seen her leave this morning around 6 with her friends Taylor and Pete Whittaker. But after Sam tells them that, his mom says that the official police story is that Whitney ran away back to Chicago. She hitchhiked back there to be with her boyfriend Jay again. But as Sam desperately tried to explain, Whitney wasn't dating Jay anymore. She had a new boyfriend here who was Pete Whittaker, so it wouldn't make sense for her to go back to Chicago. So he knew something was up, something was awry, but no one wanted to listen to him. He even tried to talk to his dad and tell him that, but he just wouldn't take his story seriously, which really pissed Sam off. He also tried to tell the current sheriff, which was his dad's boss at the time, Killian Cleary. He tried to explain to him and tell him the same exact story, that his sister had a boyfriend here and it wouldn't make sense for her to run away like that. But he also didn't really pay attention. And all Sam wanted to do was help, but his dad said that they didn't need his help anymore. He already helped by telling them that little story of what he thinks happened, but then ended up just getting sent to his room, which obviously kind of made him very, very angry. And it's after he storms off, throws a little temper tantrum, and goes to his room that he starts thinking about where Whitney could be, if she was scared, if she was alone, or even if she was dead. Ending up thinking about the treehouse story and the ceremony, wondering if she had went into the treehouse without performing the ritual and ended up going missing and dying like countless other people had before in Drisking. He says here, I sat at the computer screen for almost a minute. Kimber's words from the last fall echoed in my brain. If you enter the treehouse without the proper ceremony, you'll disappear and then you'll die. And this is the point where Sam sort of becomes obsessed with these urban legends of Drisking, with these little fairy tales revolving the town. He starts going really into it, trying to understand the Triple Tree, the Skinned Men, the Shiny Gentlemen, all these things, trying to understand what they mean and where Whitney could possibly fit into this equation to find his sister before something bad happens, or maybe thinking that something bad already did happen to his sister. So he decides to go back out to the Triple Tree where Kyle and Kimber are already waiting for him, saying that they knew he'd come, and then he immediately goes to check to see if his sister's name was carved into the tree. And then it says he was running up to the tree, screaming his sister's name, hollering out for Whitney, hoping that she might have been at the treehouse, but then it says he found it freshly carved near the top, Whitney W. And the final line of the first part of Borrasca says, my breath froze in my chest and my vision blurred with unwelcome tears. And as the sun took its last desperate breath before plunging into the deep of the horizon, a deafening metallic whirl sang out from the wilderness and spilled down the mountainside. And now that takes us to Borrasca 2. So Borrasca 2 throws us into the future a bit. It's whenever Sam is now in high school. It's been a couple years since Whitney disappeared, and it starts off with him being asleep in the sandwich shop that he works at that is owned by the Prescott family when Jimmy Prescott walks in and catches him sleeping. And they have a little bit of banter back and forth or whatever, and then Jimmy ends up asking for Mira, who is the manager of this sandwich shop, and then he says he's in the back and that he wants to talk to her. And when he goes back and tells Mira that Jimmy Prescott is out front wanting to talk to her, she just goes ahead and tells him to go home for the day, even though he has 3 hours left on his shift. But she points out that Jimmy's been the only customer they've had all day, so it should be fine. And that's something we find out throughout the story, is that this sandwich shop, it's been operating in the red heavily since it opened, but they refuse to close the shop. And the fact that it's been operating with such losses is pretty hard on Mira. It's adding to the amount of stress that she already has. But anyways, we go from this, after Sam leaves work, we go to Crystal Lake, where he meets up with Kyle and Kimber, who are now dating. They finally started dating each other, and they're just kind of hanging out, doing what high schoolers do, doing what kids do, just hanging out and, drinking, smoking, whatnot at the lake. And while they're talking, they get on the topic of how he got off work so early, to which Sam says that Jimmy Prescott came in, and once again, Kimber responds and says, ooh, he totally freaks me out. He's been staring at me since like 5th grade. And I gotta say, man, the square goes in the square hole perfectly with this line. Man, oh man, that line right there might probably be one of the more impactful foreshadowing lines reading it the second time through. I'll tell you what. It hits you harder than a right hook from Mike Tyson. But then they pretty quickly transition from talking about Jimmy Prescott to talking about his dad, Tom Prescott, and they end up talking about how he apparently got put into a home, like a nursing home of sorts, by his family a few years ago. And they state that the reason he was put into this home in the first place is that he started developing dementia, and then his family just threw him in the home to save the embarrassment from the public, which is a pretty fucked up thing to do, but I gotta say, not nearly the most fucked up thing that's gonna happen in this story. Anyways, this is the point where Phil Saunders and Mike Sutton come over to talk to them, and these are two kind of insignificant characters in this story. They're just some kids that are also in the main three characters class, but they do have somewhat of an impactful part of the story, so I felt like they were worth bringing up. Phil Saunders had briefly dated Kimber, they bring up, and Kyle kind of hates him for that. But other than that, there's really not a huge connection between these characters. And it seems like the only reason she wrote these characters into this moment is to bring up the point of people going missing, because Mike brings up the only reason he's even smoking weed around the sheriff's son, because Sam's dad has now been promoted to the sheriff in this little time skip as well, is that it's his cousin's death anniversary. It's been 5 years since she disappeared, and her name was Hannah. And then after that, Mike says, "Too many people disappear in these woods, man," as he exhaled a cloud of smoke like a real cool dude. And then Phil, being higher than giraffe pussy, says, "Yeah, man, you know, sometimes when I'm high, I can see them all. And I feel like I know the answer to the mystery, man. Like, I'm so close to solving it. It's just something I can see. Like, they're all puzzle pieces, and in my mind, I see the puzzle put together, but I can't tell what the picture is of, you know?" To which Kyle says, "You're fucking high, Saunders," and I couldn't agree more. He is higher than the Empire State Building. He's higher than the Twin Towers before they came crashing down. But Phil responds and says, "We all are, man. We all are. Everyone in this town is drinking the fucking Kool-Aid." Foreshadowing, once again, whole lot. Oh, big ol' Wee woo, wee woo, wee woo. That's my foreshadowing alert. Every time a line is big foreshadowing and very much more impactful after you know what's going on, after you read it a second time through, that's the sound I'm gonna make. Wee woo, wee woo. But then he keeps talking out of his ass and says, "Yeah, I see all those people. Hannah, Paige, Jason Metley. Hell, I even see your sister, Walker." And then this, of course, makes everything kind of awkward. And then Mike says, "Nah, Whitney Walker ran away to St. Louis, remember? Because that was the official story that the police went with, and the story they put out. And it seems like everyone was just waiting for what Sam was going to say, how he was going to respond, because he hadn't really talked about it, it says. He was kind of suppressing everything, and no one, especially Kyle and Kimber, knew how he felt about the situation. And then we get a little bit of internal monologue from Sam, and he says that he loved both Kyle and Kimber and wanted to talk to them about it, but he just couldn't. Everyone thought that he'd spent the last 7 years quietly grieving and that he'd put the incident behind him. At least that's what he tried to show them. But the truth was that he'd never given up on Whitney, and that he was secretly very, very obsessed with this whole mystery going on in Drisking, and he was always constantly trying to put it together and find out what happened to his sister. But then Sam ends up responding and says, "Yeah, it's true, she ran off with this guy Jay from our hometown." And then after Sam answers, Kyle kind of steers the conversation away, and then Phil and Saunders end up leaving them, and it's just back to our main three beloved characters. And this is where we also find out that Kimber's mom has been spiraling down a bit. Her depression is getting worse and worse, and her mom actually called her right after Phil and Mike walked away from the conversation, asking her if she could come home to be with her, and they say that it's only 2 o'clock on a Sunday, and she says that she knows, but her parents have been fighting a lot lately, and she doesn't want to leave her mom alone too long. And that's a theme you're going to realize continues throughout this story, is that Kimber's mom becomes more and more clingy with her, up until a point that it feels very, very forced. I guess that's the best word for it, but it just keeps ramping up throughout the story. But then we get back to Sam and his dad talking, and his dad is really cracking down on truancy in school. So he's making his son, Sam, go to school, even though it's the sophomore skip day. And it's in this conversation that we start to see the first strains of the relationship between Sam and his dad. Because I guess this isn't a huge spoiler alert, but Sam and his dad's relationship deteriorates drastically as we go throughout this story. And you can see it in the little subtleties of the way she writes this story. It starts off with him referring to his dad as dad, and then slowly as they start to disagree more, and he feels like Sam feels like his dad isn't doing everything he can to find his sister, to find Whitney. He starts to call him like Sheriff, and then by the end of the story, he's only referring to him as Sheriff Walker or Graham. He doesn't even really see him as his dad by the end of this thing. But Kyle and Kimber end up going to school to be with Sam because they know his dad's forcing him to go, and that's just how good of friends they are. But then once they get to lunch, I believe it is. Yeah, once they go to lunch, they realize that, or Sam realizes that Kimber isn't there, and then Kyle explains that she left early because her mom said she needed her once again. And this is where we also get the information that Kimber's mom apparently hates Kyle. She doesn't ever want Kyle to come into their house. She doesn't really want Kimber hanging out with Kyle. And foreshadowing, I'll explain it all later. Woo woo wee woo. That's a bit of foreshadowing there. The fact that Kimber's mom hates Kyle. It'll make sense in a bit. But while they're on lunch talking about all this between like Kimber and her mom situation, Kyle and Sam end up just saying, hey, let's not even go back to school today because the teachers have already taken attendance and no one's going to care if we're gone because no one's even there in the first place. And I think it's pretty funny because this line right here, Kyle says, yeah, I mean, you put in 4 periods. You've been a good son. And Officer Dickass already came around and collected the attendance sheets. And Sam says, Dickass? Really? You're better than that, man. And Kyle says, Officer Ass Dick. You're fucking baked, Kyle. Seriously, man. Let's go. So then they leave, and Sam has to work today. So he decides to, swing by GameStop before work to see if they had something, but they didn't. So he ends up going and dropping Kyle off at Kimber's house, even though her mom is most likely going to throw him out again as she has before, and then he ends up dropping you off and then going to go to work. And when Sam gets to work, he gets there like 3 hours early, I believe it is, and he hears Mira crying in her office, and then he goes in and goes to ask her if she's okay, and she says, oh, I'm sorry, wipes her eyes and says, is it 4 o'clock already? And he says, no, it's only 2:15. He just thought he'd come by early. And then she says, oh yeah, it's his ditch day, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And she says she don't understand. The store has been operating in the red ever since she was hired to manage it. What is she doing wrong? So it seems like she's blaming herself for the failure of the sandwich shop, even though it's literally been operating in the red since before she was hired. But she's putting it on herself as the manager, thinking that she's doing something wrong. And we also find out in this conversation, after Sam ends up calling her husband because she's very distressed, he feels like her husband could potentially help her, and he ends up showing up. And then we find out that on top of her being stressed out about the manager position at the sandwich shop that's failing, they also have been having some trouble in their marriage. They've been trying to conceive a child, but they can't get pregnant. And Mira seems to be blaming her husband, or at least that's what her husband says to Sam. So he's just some high schooler being thrown into the middle of a very serious infertility issue between a married couple, which I could only imagine has to be one of the most awkward positions to be in. But then Mira ends up just telling him to go home for the day. She'll pay him for the whole day, and her husband will take care of everything from there. By the way, a little bit of retrospective wee woo foreshadowing. I forgot the fucking word. Foreshadowing on that infertility thing. That's a big key point coming up soon. But then after he leaves, he goes to pick up Kyle, to which he finds him on the curb because Kimber's mom would not let him in again. And then Sam explains that some fucking weird shit is going on in this town. And then he explains to the whole situation at the sandwich shop to him and all that kind of stuff. And then Kimber came outside real quick to hug Kyle goodnight, and then Sam and Kyle end up leaving, and going doing their own thing. And it's while Sam and Kyle are hanging out together without Kimber after her mom, kind of made her stay home, or she wanted to stay home to take care of her mom and be with her and all that, that Sam explains a story that Mira told him while her husband was in the sandwich shop and they were going over that whole infertility thing. He explains how Mira is a McCaskey, which apparently she's the last of the McCaskies because of an issue that happened with 4 McCaskey brothers that went into the mines in Drisking, and they ended up getting lost, and they ended up having to explode the mines to demolish them, a controlled demolition to stop people from exploring them and going missing. And Sam asks if he thinks that the disappearances of the McCaskey brothers and the whole mine demolition has anything to do with the disappearances in the town, because they also started to seemingly happen around the same time. But they start speculating, they start wondering what they could do to figure some things out, and this is when they get the idea to go to the Historical Society to find out more about the mines. So they end up going into the Historical Society and they talk to this woman who is over it, and they say, yeah, they have a few questions about Drisking's history, and they end up sitting down with her, telling her it's for an essay they have to write. So then they end up sitting down with her, telling her that this is for a paper they have to write, and we find out her name is Catherine Scanlon. And the first thing they ask is, we want to know about the McCaskey kids. And she said, oh, a dark part of history, but still history nonetheless. And Kyle asks, how did they die? And she says, well, they didn't die. I mean, they certainly perished in the mines, but their bodies were never recovered, so we don't know the answer to that. I would think dehydration, starvation, and exhaustion killed them within days of getting lost down there. And to your second question, that was 1953, I believe. And the mines closed that year? Well, actually, the mines officially closed the year after. There was a legal spat between the city and the Prescott family, who wanted to leave the mines open until the bodies were found. The city won, and the mines were condemned. And that's when Catherine continues and says that the Prescott and McCaskey family were closely related. Tom Prescott was paying teams of unemployed miners to go into the mines and search for the bodies, but then the city had enough of it. They said the mountain was unstable and didn't want any more deaths, so the mines had been abandoned years before and were structurally unsafe. After the city banned the recovery teams from the mines, the members of the Prescott family started going down there themselves. Finally, the city had enough, and they had the mines collapsed. And it was when they collapsed the mines with these explosives that it led to the incident, as she calls it. She says by this time the mines had been unprofitable for a few years and the city was quite broke. They hired a less than reputable company to collapse the mines, and, well, when they set off the explosives, they accidentally broke into Drisking's water table. The city went into debt, trying to purify the water of silt and iron ore. It wasn't until 2 years later that things started getting better, thanks to the Prescotts, who truly did revitalize Drisking. So this is what we found out later is responsible for the infertility issue in Drisking, which we also found that out later, but I'm bringing it to you now, giving you a little bit of an early Christmas present. We found out that pretty much everybody in Drisking, I don't know if it's confirmed that everyone, but a majority of people in Drisking are infertile. So most of the people in Drisking are exactly like Mira and her husband, due to the silt and iron ore that's in the water. I looked it up, and apparently that heavy metals in the water and whatnot and toxins can cause infertility, so it seems to be loosely based in reality there. But anyways, regardless, most of the town is infertile. They can't have kids, and that does play a big part in the whole darkness of this story, which I won't reveal to you just yet. But right after she explained that about the mine collapsing to them, Kimber messages Kyle and said she wanted him to come over. So they end up thanking Catherine for her time, and they go to be with Kimber. So they go meet with Kimber, and they get to talking, and they end up coming up with the idea to go visit Tom Prescott in this nursing home that they find out is about 40 minutes away, to get the truth straight from the horse's mouth. Because he's the one who led the whole rebuilding of Drisking thing. He's the one who pretty much revitalized the town. He led the revitalization. So they put their plan into action to go visit Tom Prescott at this little old folks home, or whatever the hell it is. So they go in acting like they're related to Tom. They just, to get past the front desk people to make it to Tom, to which they don't really have much trouble at all doing that. So they go back there and they start to talk to him. They say, Tom Prescott, Kimber said, smiling. And it says he didn't look up and wondered if he'd heard her at all. Kimber took a deep breath to try again, but the old man suddenly slammed his fist on the table. I'm him, goddammit! I'm Mr. Thomas Prescott. Don't call me Tom. People's kids used to have more respect. So just from that line right there, you can definitely tell that Tom is racist. But she apologizes, and then he says, you kids don't have no respect. Don't you even know who I am? It's my son that's done it. That boy's mama should have whipped him, but she was soft, and now he's running around my town spreading his vulgarity and disrespect. And they start playing along with him, just telling him what he wants to hear, fluffing up his ego, telling him he's the best thing since sliced bread. And he says, I did what I had to do. It was my town. It still is. Who are you, little girl, to come in here and suggest otherwise? And Kimber says, oh, no, that's not what I said. And as for who we are, we're Mira McCaskey's kids. Do you remember the McCaskeys? Huh, so you're Ada's granddaughter. That explains why you're not there. We exchanged puzzled looks. We're right here, Mr. Prescott, Kimber said. You know what I mean, young lady. They all know. They know I rescued the town. That's my town. Of course, they were going to let me do anything I wanted as long as the money kept coming in. That's why it's my town. Is the money still coming in? Kimber tested. Well, you're here, aren't you? They didn't like it, but they took the money. They didn't know. Not everything. They didn't, but they suspected some. And they must have been okay with it because they kept electing Cleary and they kept taking the money. So at this point in the little conversation, you can tell that something dark is going on in Drisking, something fishy, if you will. Some illegal thing that they're doing to get an insane amount of money to revitalize the town and to keep the town thriving how it currently is. What exactly it is, we don't know just yet. But he continues and says Prescott picked up a pawn and ran his finger over it as he talked. It's just a powder, So unassuming. A fine, soft powder. The powder doesn't know what it is. It doesn't know it's bad. It's the people who say it's bad, but it needed to be done. You know that, Ada. You know we had to do it. And Kimber keeps him going. She says, I know we had to, but it's your son. I don't think he's doing it right. Well, of course he isn't. And he slammed his fist on the table again. They were mine. He took them from me. He thought he could do it better, but he took mine and he ruined my legacy. Decades of work, and now it's all run by the powder. It's the dust of the crumbled empire. And then Sam kind of ruins the information they're getting out of him by saying, what about the skinned men? And he just confuses the already confused old man. And he says, what are you talking about, boy? And the treehouse, the triple tree. What is it? What is it for? The triple tree? I didn't authorize that. We paid triple the price, but it was only for a short while. When things were slow. We certainly never charged triple. That's bad business. Where is Has my idiot boy been telling you that? Did he offer triple for him? He's ruining my town, isn't he? God damn it, Jimmy. You get him in here, Ada. Get my boy on the phone. You tell Jimmy I want to talk to him. You tell him they're still mine. Ada, get Jimmy on the phone. And then he kind of starts going off on his dementia-stricken ramblings, just yelling about getting Jimmy in there to talk to him. So they end up having to leave because he kind of goes into a blind old man rage. And it's after they leave and pull over, Sam says that he has to know what really happened to Whitney. And then Kimber gets a phone call and it's from her dad. She answers and says, Dad? And then there's silence and she says, what? Wait, what do you mean? More silence and she says, Dad again, with more silence following. And then she says, no, wait, slow down. Hello? And then she took the phone away from her ear and said, something's happened to my mom and she's at the hospital, as she started to cry. And then Kyle drove ridiculously fast to the hospital to get there, to which there was a deputy waiting for them. He refused to answer Kimber's questions, and then he led them to Sam's father, to which Sam's dad, the new sheriff, took Kimber and Sam in opposite directions, to which he set Sam down and explained what was going on. We sat down in a corner and I stared at my hands as he quietly explained that Mrs. DeStaro had gone grocery shopping around 1 o'clock, come home, put the groceries away, made 2 lasagnas and a meatloaf and put them in the freezer. Then she got in her car, drove to the hospital, parked in the shade, took the stairs up 7 floors to the roof, and jumped off of it. She lived long enough to apologize to the EMT who found her. And the final line of Borrasca 2 says, I watched Kimber fall apart as her mother's body slowly grew cold in the morgue 1 floor beneath us. So now Borrasca is getting real. It's getting dark and it's getting downright depressing. So we've had Sam's sister disappearing, seeming like she's never going to come back. And now on top of that, Kimber's mom just killed herself. She jumped off of the top of the hospital, which undoubtedly is going to wreck Kimber. And that takes us to Borrasca 3, where they start off, Kyle and Sam do, in a conversation about Kimber and her mom. Kyle asking if he thinks that Sam thinks Kimber blames herself for her mother's suicide, to which Sam says, probably. And then he had a little bit of an internal monologue after Kyle asked if he thought that Kimber was okay, saying that he'd certainly not been okay when Whitney died, and Kimber was even closer to her mom than he was to his sister. So at this point, Sam has accepted the fact that Whitney is most likely dead, because it's been about 7 years since she's gone missing, and it's just a cold case. They don't have a single individual lead. So he says she was definitely not okay. And then Kyle says, Sam, seriously, I'm fucking freaking out here. It's been 2 days. And she's just not talking to anyone. And then Sam sort of comforts Kyle, telling him, dude, you know, her mom just committed suicide. She was very close to her mom. She just needs some time, and then she'll be fine. She'll talk to you again. But obviously something like this is going to take a lot of time to accept and just, you know, learn to live with. Most of all, she just needs her space right now. So here we got a pretty big conflict in the story, where they think they heard Kimber's dad talking about a note that was left, but then Sam's dad, the new sheriff, says there wasn't a letter. And Kyle doesn't really believe Sam's dad, and Sam himself honestly doesn't completely believe his dad over the whole Whitney situation, so he doesn't know what to think given this whole suicide note business. But then he says that the truth was he did know what he heard. Mr. DeStaro had said something about a letter to the cops, but then whenever he got home and asked his dad about it, his dad, the sheriff, said, Sam, I don't know what to tell you. And DeStaro didn't leave a suicide note, and this is the first I've heard of it. So clearly, I don't need to tell you this, you can read between the lines. Someone is lying here. Someone is telling a bit of a fib tale. But now with Kimber being in the situation that she is, trying to learn to, you know, accept what just happened, this terrible, tragic situation, Sam and Kyle are left to themselves to try to go on without the glue that held them together. They explain that everything just kind of feels bad without Kimber being there. She was the one that kind of made them be responsible and watched after them and did their fucking homework and everything. So they are pretty much nothing without her. They realize how much they heavily relied upon Kimber. She was the crutch of their little friend group. But then out of nowhere, Kimber shows up at school and Sam sees her and is kind of shocked at first because he didn't expect to see her. And then he asks if she'd seen Kyle yet and says no, that she has next period with him. And Sam says he has been worried about you. And they just get to talking, you know, asking what's going on, saying he's there for whatever she needs. And then they go and see Kyle, and it says as soon as Kyle's seen her from down the hall, he slammed his locker shut and walked towards us with such intensity that I began to wonder if maybe he was mad, pushing dozens of people off to the side, saying that when he finally reached them, Kyle threw his backpack against the wall and swooped Kimber up in a sort of way you'd see in an old black and white movie. And then Sam asked Kimber about the note situation. He asked if her mom did leave a letter, to which she says, what? And he says, I heard your dad talking about a letter on Tuesday, talking about the funeral. And she says, oh. And then she responds that her mom did leave a letter, but she doesn't know what it says, and she hasn't seen it because she asked for it from her dad when they got home, and he'd said that she had misheard him and that there was no letter. And then Sam says that it's very unlikely that they both misheard him, and that he's known his dad his entire life, and he knows when he's lying. And he thinks that he very much is lying about there not being a note. And here's a big wee-woo, 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 because we actually do, spoiler, I guess, there is a note, and the note gets read to us relatively soon. I'm going to wait till the end to reveal everything, but the note, It lays out all the secrets of Borrasca, of Drisking, everything. All the darkness, all the secrets, everything that the town has been hiding. But they keep talking about the letter. They say that all they know is that it contains the word, or the name Prescott. And then they hatch this little plan to get the letter and find out what it actually says. And this plan involves, whenever they go to Kimber's mom's funeral, her acting as if she's distressed, needing to step out, to which Kyle is going to accompany her, go back to her house while her dad is actually out, because she said he never leaves the house now, so they can go into his study and get the letter and find out what it says. But while they're at the funeral, things don't exactly go as planned. Things fall apart pretty much instantly. They go in and they start talking to Kimber's dad to sort of distract him so she can slip out. And then once that happens, Kyle tries to leave, saying that Kimber's upset. He needs to go comfort her. But Kimber's dad says, absolutely not. You're not going to comfort my daughter. You're not going to be with her. Sam can go see her. So then Sam goes to go with her to go back to Kimber's house because Kimber had Sam's car keys. They were going to take his car to go to the house to get the letter. So then Kyle is stuck with Kimber's dad and Sam goes to go with Kimber, but Kimber sends a message and says that she's sorry and that she already left and she's going to go by herself. So now the plan has completely fell to shambles. Kimber has gone by herself. Sam comes back to talk to Kyle and he says, where's Kimber? What did you guys find? And that's when Sam lets him know that he doesn't know because she left without him. And now at this point, Kimber isn't answering any calls or texts and they don't really know what's going on. They don't know if she found the letter. They just really have no clue as to what's going on. And then they note that they see two deputies walk out the front doors of the church and then they decide to call up Phil Saunders to give them a ride to Kimber's house. So they call him saying say that it's an emergency and that they need him to come ASAP. And then while they're waiting on Saunders to come pick them up, Kyle's phone dings and it's Kimber and she says, I found it. And then Kyle responds very quickly and says, they're coming for you, Kay. And then she says, they're here. And that was the last message that they got from Kimber. And then when Phil came to pick them up and drop them off at the DeStaro house, they said the front door to the house was unlocked and no one was home. And then Kyle and Sam drove back to the funeral and everyone was already gone, the very few people that did actually show up. So then they drove back to Kimber's house again, but it was the same as they'd left it when they initially got there. And then by this time, it says Kyle was an absolute wreck. He'd called her so many times that he was sure it killed her battery. But at this point, all the calls were going straight to voicemail and the text were being unanswered. So then Sam decides to call his dad and tell him what's going on, says that Kimber's gone, she's missing. They tried everything to find her. She's not answering her calls. Samson and Grigg left and he thinks they went to Kimber's house to get her, and he thinks that they're still working for Cleary and that something bad is going on. And then Sam's dad says, whoa, slow down. Come by the station and let's talk. I'll take a statement from you boys. I'll send a couple officers over to investigate the house right now. Just calm down, Sam. We'll handle this. So Sam realizes that with nowhere else left to turn, that he's going to trust his dad with this one. Even though they think they can't trust the cops, he's going to trust his dad to potentially help find Kimber, even though he never ended up finding his own daughter. So after they give their statements, Sam's dad says, I want you to know that at this point, it looks like the DeStaros left town voluntarily. And they try to tell him there's no way that Kimber would leave voluntarily. And then he says, well, let me rephrase that. Jacob DeStaro left town voluntarily. Kimber is a minor and has no legal rights here. If her dad said they're leaving, then they're leaving. But then they bring up the point that she's not answering her phone and that nothing was packed in the house. And he says maybe they're just getting away for a while, maybe going to her relatives. I can't theorize as to why she wouldn't answer her phone other than maybe she wants to be left alone for a while. Which obviously none of this is making sense. They know something more is going on, and this isn't the answer that they were looking for or hoping for. And this also leads to a big argument between Sam and his dad, because Sam ends up saying after his dad says he'll investigate this, he says, like you investigated Whitney's disappearance thoroughly. And then Sam's dad apparently snapped and says, Sam, with more force than he'd ever heard him use. I'm tired of listening to you insinuate that I didn't do everything I could to find Whitney. I loved your sister more than you can imagine. She's my daughter, Sammy, and I will never give up. And then they bring up that the deputies left the funeral, and they say, well, Mr. Walker, why did the deputies leave during the funeral? And he says, oh, Samson and Grigg, they left the funeral because I sent them out on a call. But at this point, Kyle and Sam, neither one of them are really buying this. They think it's a bunch of bullshit, and they realize they're going to have to take this all into their own hands to figure out what happened to Kimber. With Kyle even straight up saying to Sam, he's lying. I know he's lying. Something bad has happened, and he's lying about it. And Sam says, what? What happened? Dude, fucking talk to me. What do you think happened? Kimber's gone, like all the others, so she's at the place where bad things happen. So at this point, Kyle's thinking that Kimber has been taken to Borrasca, which obviously Kimber being gone and them thinking that potentially same thing happened to her that happened to all the other people that had gone missing in the town and they've never been found, took a toll on them. It shattered them into tiny pieces and they lost a giant piece of themselves because Kimber was they were all very close, and losing her was like losing the person they held dearest. And Kyle ends up yelling, he ends up snapping a bit, saying, "Yes, Sam, fucking think about it. It's the treehouse. It's all the same. Borrasca, the skin men, the triple tree, your sister, the mountain. It's all the fucking same. It's the Prescott Empire, and now Kimber has been fucking consumed by it." And then he continues and says, "We have to go to Ambercott, right? It all starts and ends at the triple tree, Sam. Surely you figured that out." So now they start to craft a plan. They start to formulate a plan, an idea of how they're going to attempt to find out where Kimber is and get her back. But then after their conversation, they pretty much decide that they're going to take this into their own hands, that they will find Kimber and figure out what's going on, the mysteries of Drisking. And then once Sam gets back to his house, he's making a sandwich and his dad's talking to him about Kimber's disappearance. And he ends up saying, "Please tell me you're still trying to find Kimber." And then it says, "The sheriff stood up from the kitchen table, looking as tired and disheveled as I felt. I promise, Sammy." And Sam says that he finally believed him. And then Sam goes over to Kyle's house the next morning to start their little search. But then Parker, Kyle's little brother, says that Sam is not there. He'd left around 5, stole his dad's truck, and that his dad was pissed, so he'd better go quick. But then he ends up calling Kyle, and Kyle says sorry that he couldn't sleep and that he's just been out looking around, walking around in the woods, seeing what he could find. And he ends up saying, "Yeah, she's out here, Sam, somewhere in these mountains. I can feel it. I know it." So then Sam goes to meet him. He says he's going to meet him at this trail so they can start searching together. And then it says that they started hiking miles and miles of the mountain and they didn't find any sign of human life. And for the next few days, if the sun was out, so were they. Kyle kept growing more desperate, and they kept crossing onto private property looking for this logging equipment that Sam's dad says was those sounds. He said the Borrasca screech was logging equipment. That's what the noise was. And while they were walking around, they were also mapping out the county's many mines to search the abandoned buildings. But the mountain was big and the needle buried deep in the haystack. And then Borrasca 3 ends by saying, "On was the 11th night of our Kimberless existence. I was awoken out of a troubled sleep by a piercing, whirling, screeching sound of death at Borrasca. I cried myself back to sleep to the tortured sounds of Kyle's own agony next door. We had felled her. Kimber was dead." So that is a downright depressing way to end Borrasca 3. And then we pick up at Borrasca 4 pretty much where we left off. So they start off by still talking about Kimber, and it seems like Kyle is about to give up. He seems hopeless. He seems like everything is lost. The thing he held dearest, which is Kimber, is gone, just like all the others, and he feels like there's no hope of ever finding her again. He even says, "We're living in hell. Drisking, it's hell in our own reality." And Sam says, "I couldn't agree more. The town I'd grown to love seems so foreign to me now." Whitney hadn't been an outlier like he thought. Missing people were the norm here, and that would make Jimmy Prescott the king. He's Satan himself. Foreshadowing. To which Kyle gets insanely pissed off, saying that he's going to kill Jimmy Prescott. And then Sam says his dad created the town that bred this shit, but I'm pretty sure the Prescotts are just running drugs. You know, the powder. Oh yeah, a drug empire would be so much more comforting than what actually is happening. But he says, yeah, and so what? He's recruiting people to be drug mules or something. And that's exactly what they do for the rest of Borrasca 4 here, is they're trying to figure out where Borrasca is, how they can find it, and how they can get Kimber back. They try to do Google searches on it and try to figure out what a Borrasca is, but they can't find any information themselves. That's when they turn back to Catherine Scanlon, saying that that's what Kimber would say, is that they need to go talk to Catherine again. So they go in telling her that they need more help for personal interest, and she's impressed that they're trying to learn over the summer. And then they say that they're there because they want to know if Borrasca is a thing or a place, to which Catherine replies and says that a guy named Wyatt told her an interesting fact once about Borrasca, and that it was actually both. And then she goes on to explain what a Borrasca is, which it's a mine that has since shut down and gone dry. And it's typically the first mine in a group of mines to shut down and go dry that is known and referred to as a Borrasca, a failed mine. So then they start asking her, trying to figure out which one of the mines went dry first, and if it's also the same mine that the McCaskey boys went missing in, but she says no, she doesn't think so, and that the mine they went missing in was very close to town, and it was one of the last to actually go dry and become unprofitable and become a failing mine. So the mine in Drisking that was actually a Borrasca was a different one from the one that those boys went missing in, and they ended up finding out which one it was. Catherine told them, she had a map of it, and it says she pointed to a small dot on the map that was at least 4 miles from where they'd been looking, and they ask if they can take it, and she says of course she has copies of it, so they decide that is where they're going. They're going to that point on the map, the Borrasca of Drisking. So they go to this mine where it was pinpointed at on the map, and they see a sign, and from what was remaining of it, they can tell the sign once said Drisking Underground Mine, but all that was left on the sign was Skinned Men, SKINNDMIN, which is where skinned men come from. And this is only the first glimpse into us seeing that what's really happening here isn't supernatural entities, anything like special, like the skinned men isn't like some actual scary skinned men. It's all based in reality, which in a way makes it much more terrifying that everything in this is just realistic. And then Kyle ends up pointing towards the north end of the camp, and it says they stepped out from the shadows into the vulnerability of the clearing, and there were several large buildings still standing, and the boarded up entrance to the ore mine was set back in the mountains. And they end up going into the largest of these buildings, which was at least 2 stories tall, they say, and they end up squeezing in through the old wooden doors of the building. And it says once they cracked open the doors and squeezed inside, there was no doubts that death was indeed present in Borrasca. And where they were standing was what they guessed was a refinery. In the middle of the room was a large silver conically shaped machine, a conveyor belt that fed into it, and the room had a sour smell. Even the dirt beneath our feet seemed to have taken on a crimson tint. And then Sam says, "This is the machine. This is where they take them," I said. "This is the place where people die." So what they just found there was the Shawnee gentleman, and everything is starting to come together now. You realize that there's nothing supernatural going on. The skinned men aren't actually skinned men, it's the shut down mine, and inside this mine is where the Shawnee gentleman is, which isn't actually a man who comes to take people, it's a machine, which we find out, I'm going to go ahead and tell you this, the Shawnee gentleman is what they use to grind up the bodies. They grind up bodies in this thing, and that's what, and all that's left is the powder from the bones, because it's an ore refinery, so it just grinds all the bones up into a fine powder, which they then spread across the mountain. So now you can see that the true monsters of this story are humans, which in a way makes it all that more frightening because it's based in reality. This could technically actually happen. But anyways, back into the story here. They say that Kimber isn't there, so they keep searching, they keep looking around. And then they end up seeing a green truck parked there that they know belongs to Jimmy Prescott. So now they're on extra high alert, so they keep searching around, keep snooping around, putting their nose into places, and they end up coming to a brown 1-story building, and as soon as they reach it, they heard noises coming from inside that they say even to him, a 16-year-old virgin, sounds of sex were unmistakable. They could hear animalistic grunting and the tired, objecting groans of an old mattress. And it says, unable to help himself, he whispered, "What the fuck?" But Kyle was already gone. All caution abandoned, running around the side of the building. And he says he followed Kyle and was hit in the face by an invisible wall of filth and suffering. The smell knocked him back, but Kyle kept on running, and he says he followed him in past crates of ramen noodles, MREs, bottled water, and boxes he had no time to read. He crossed another threshold and was suddenly surrounded by people. So many people. He skidded to a halt and realized he was standing in a sort of a dorm. Rows and rows of beds on either side of me with people strapped to them. Some of them wearing dirty rags and some wearing nothing at all. And as he's looking around, he notices that all these people in here on these beds are women and that their stomachs all seemed bloated. And says that they were all looking at him through tired, dead eyes, and others were looking away. And then that's when he puts it all together that they're all women and they're all pregnant and that some are tied down to their bed and some of them aren't. But he didn't see Kimber in this room, so he kept running around, promising that he will come back to help all of them, and that he promises he will do this as soon as he finds Kimber. So they keep searching around, they keep running around, and they find this door that they push open, and they say as soon as they push it open, they see Jimmy, something they'd expected to see, but the scene was not what they at all expected. They said that Jimmy was hunched over the bed of an almost unrecognizable, unresponsive Christy, treating her like an animal. She watched him through the slits of her dead eyes, but she didn't call for help. He thought he saw a tear run down her cheek before she turned her face away from him to face the wall on the other side. What the fuck? I didn't even realize the words were audible. I had never seen this depth of human suffering. And this is when Jimmy finally realizes that someone is there, someone has caught him in the act, and it says his brief surprise quickly registered into a smile that turned his insides to ice. And that he didn't even stop what he was doing, but Sam couldn't force himself into the room to stop. He couldn't make himself go any further to stop what was happening in front of him. And then it was at this point that Sam heard Kyle screaming his name from across the building, and so he ran towards where he heard Kyle, and Kyle says, "Back here, hurry, please. I found Kimber." So he was following his voice through the maze of beds and the cacophony of voices that began to follow him, saying, "Help us, please." And he says it was only a handful of girls that were yelling at him, but it sounded so thunderously loud as it was being filtered through his guilt, and that the weight of their misery was dropped down upon him and almost pushed him into the ground. That's what I'm saying about this writing, man. The writing is just insane. It's so well written. But he keeps saying that he will help these people, he'll help them, he'll get help, but he keeps running and trying to help Kyle get Kimber because that was their first priority. So then they start to unbuckle Kimber. They start to try to get her out of this bed and get her out of this god-awful, sickening situation. And then they hear Jimmy's voice ring out through the building saying, "Oh, boys, do you think you're hiding? I know where to find you. I know right where I put that girl." And then Kyle says, "I'll fucking kill you, Prescott, you sick cunt. I'll fucking stomp all your bones and bleed you out, you little motherfucker." And then they finally got the final strap off of Kimber and yelled, "Go now." And then they pulled her off the bed and started to quickly try to get out of there. But Kimber's legs could barely support her because she was so heavily sedated and so weakly breathing. And it was while they were trying to make their escape that Sam sees something that stops him dead in his tracks. He sees his sister, and he calls out weakly and says, "Whitney." And then Kyle says, "Sam, let's fucking go." And Sam says, "I can't." And he turned to Kyle as tears went down his cheek, and then Kyle's seen her too, and he says, I can't stay. I have to get Kimber away from here, please." But he knew that Sam wasn't going to go with him now, and Sam says, "Good luck, bro," I said, and then we were both running in different directions. So now Kyle is taking Kimber out, trying to get her to safety, and Sam is staying in this terrible place to try to get his sister, who has been in there for like 7 years at this point, trying to get her out. And he describes his sister as being insanely thin, but with really long, stringy hair, and that everything on her looked brittle except for her stomach, which was bubbled out like an overblown balloon. And that Whitney refused to look at him and even flinched as he desperately tried to unbuckle her from her bed. And that's when he heard Jimmy walk up from behind him, but he says he didn't even bother to turn around because he didn't know what else to do. And this is when Jimmy says he already has Cleary looking for Kyle, and that no one's going to make it off this mountain because they make too much noise, and that they will find Kyle and Kimber. And this is where Jimmy starts to disclose everything about the situation here. He starts to tell all the secrets. He says that they call this the stables, and that all the women in here they call the horses, and that pretty much they have this whole human trafficking scheme going on. And this is where he explains the situation from start to finish, how everything is ran, and he gives us a peek behind the curtains. So like he said, this place here is called the stables. The women they refer to as the horses. And then there's of course the shiny gentleman, which they use after the women become useless to them. And that's the sound that pierces through the town every so often, is the sound of people being grinded up after they're no more useful to them pumping out babies. And each of the women in there, they have them heavily sedated. They break them in every way. It's such a gut-wrenching thought thinking about it. But each person that is involved with this operation is assigned certain girls, and they even name the kids starting with certain initials to make sure that no crossbreeding happens. So if you want to take a guess real quick before I say this to you, guess what Kyle's name starts with? Guess what Kimber's name starts with? Guess what Killian Cleary's name starts with? The ex-sheriff. Yeah. Kyle and Kimber are brother and sister, related through having the same dad, Killian Cleary. Because if you'll remember what I said before, everyone in Drisking can't have kids. They're infertile as a result of the mine explosions. So they have to rely on this stable operation, the Borrasca operation, to actually have children. And these children come from the people running the whole operation, which is the sheriff, Jimmy Prescott, and then like one or two other people. But at this point in time, there was Killian Cleary, who was still sort of involved, even though he stepped down as the sheriff, Jimmy Prescott, and then of course, the final player in this little game was Sam's dad, the new sheriff, Graham Walker. So now all those foreshadowing lines are making a lot more sense to you, huh? Whenever it says Jimmy has been looking at Kimber weird since the 5th grade. The dude is sick. Every one of the people involved in this is a sick bastard. So sickening. It's just absolutely putrid to the max. But Jimmy says that this whole operation is about the babies. Some of them they sell because he says you won't believe what people are willing to pay for a newborn, for an infant. And that also they do community service with these babies by giving them to the people in town, allowing them to adopt kids because, like I said, no one in town can have kids. And that it was actually Jimmy's dad, Tom Prescott, who started this whole operation, and that is how all the money's coming in that allowed them to revitalize the town. And all the while he's explaining this, Sam is trying to get his sister Whitney to get up and like come with him, but she doesn't seem to want to do that. She's been so broken that she just accepted the situation she's in, and she doesn't want to look at Sam because it's brought up in the story here that Sam is pretty much a spitting image of his dad. He looks exactly like him, he's built exactly like him, and overall, I guess Whitney just sees Sam as their dad, which she knows that her dad is the one that allowed her to be put in this situation in the first place. But then Cleary comes back in with Kyle, but not Kimber, and they can't find out where Kyle hid Kimber at, and they try to beat it out of Kyle. They even beat him to the point of him almost being dead. They straight up put him in a close to coma state. They pretty much beat almost all the life out of him right in front of Sam's face, and they say they're not allowed to kill Sam because he's the sheriff's son. But they never end up finding where Kimber is. But after they beat the ever-living shit, just beat the life out of Kyle, they end up leaving, and then Sam, everything, you know, they go back and all this kind of stuff. Kyle's in the hospital, being taken care of, and then Sam's dad says, Sam, I'm doing the best to do damage control in the situation, but if Kyle dies or his parents sue, there's nothing I can do to keep you out of court. So the story being spun is that Sam snapped and beat the ever-living crap out of Kyle, nearly killing him. And at this point, Sam doesn't know that his dad's involved, or at the very least, doesn't know that his dad knows what's going on, because he's explaining the whole situation, trying to get his dad to believe him about seeing Kimber, seeing Whitney and all this, but his dad's just still denying it and trying to spin the narrative, and he's believing what's being said instead of what he clearly knows. He's lying to Sam is what I'm saying. Like he's been doing the entire story. But then Sam says, when I had assured myself that the Kyle I knew was dead and only his empty husk remained, I left his house and hitchhiked out of town. After I spent 4 drunken, drug-fueled years in Chicago, I came home one day to find a letter waiting for me. It didn't have a return address, but it was postmarked California. I knew it was from her before I even picked it up. She'd written so many of my assignments for me that I knew Kimber's handwriting better than my own. It was a letter. The letter. I read it only once, many years ago, until I sat down to transcribe it today. So this letter that I'm about to read to you is the letter that Kimber's mom left to her before she killed herself. I know you aren't going to understand why we did the things we did. It was all born out of love. At least it started that way. You're everything to me, and you'll always be my daughter. Do you understand? And I'm leaving this world because of what I've done to you, not because of what you are. I don't want you to be upset about what you are, because who you are is beautiful. My dearest, this town has done horrible things, and all of us who live here are guilty. Read this letter and leave this place. I need to tell you all of this. I need to start at the beginning. Somewhere along the way, decades ago, the major population of Drisking became unable to bear children. Most people blame the town for letting the iron ore leak into our water table during the collapse of our mines. This is the same water table that still provides the town's water today. They were never quite able to fix it, and ore is toxic and exposure can cause infertility. The town did, and still does, suffer greatly from its effects. And the Prescotts, they solved this problem that no one could solve. It was an ugly, crass solution, but most people were happy to look away when they were able to raise families again. You see, they took girls, mostly women from other places, and they impregnated them and gave us their babies. And the town came under the care of Thomas Prescott when he started to sell some of the babies on the side for a profit to rich couples. And the sheriff, he helped him do this. But then an ugly rumor started that they were selling to human traffickers, and the Prescotts had to offer triple the price for girls. And in town, we began to murmur. But we once again turned the other cheek when the city was suddenly flooded with money because of how well the traffickers paid. People had well-paying jobs again and were proud to call Drisking home. So we said nothing, and those that did were taken to the mountain. And I wanted to stop real quick because this actually brings up a really interesting thought to me. The whole philosophical thought of, is complacency or being compliant in a bad situation, does that make you, sorry, I'm burpy. Being complacent in a bad thing like this, does that make you a bad person? It really gets the gears turning, because you start thinking, if you're gonna be against it and they're gonna kill you, then why not just save yourself and be complacent? Why not just go along with the norm? Does following the norm make you inherently a bad person if it's what everybody has accepted? Or should you stand up for what should be the morally right thing and then, end up losing your life but dying as a morally right person? That's all I'm going to talk about that. I could keep going down the rabbit hole of it, but the letter continues and says, because that is where they do it. There is a place on the mountain where the women are taken, kimber, drifters, runaways, and if their parents choose it, sometimes the girls in town are even sold back. They arrange to sell the girls and they meet them at the tree halfway between our town and their baby mill. Sometimes kids play there now. I think you played there. The Prescotts and the sheriff are the ones who impregnate the girls, and the children are named after them. P children are for the Prescotts, and K children are for the sheriff. And then, when the women become too sick or too old to deliver profitable babies, they are sent through a giant machine that we use to refine ore, and their bodies are crushed and the blood and skin stripped away, and what remains of them are their stolen children and the dust of their bones. And that's all. And all that's left of their bodies is the powder that they spread over the mountain to hide our crimes. So now it's starting to make sense why Kimber's dad hid the letter, and why the sheriff, Sam's dad, also covered up there being a letter, because it would expose all their secrets that the whole town has been working for decades to hide and cover up. But she continues and says, I'm telling you this, Kimber, because you are one of those children. Most of your friends are one of those children. Please get out of Drisking before your father finds this letter. Run away and never come back, and never speak of it to anyone. Their industry has deep roots now, and the traffickers have lofty connections. Don't tell anyone. Don't keep this letter. Don't look back. I love you. I'm sorry I have to leave you. We all have to answer for our sins, and I'm ready to burn in hell for mine. Love always and forever, Mom. And that is how Borrasca 4 ends. As Sam is leaving town, he develops this drug addiction to cope with everything that has happened to him. Kyle is in a vegetative state, and it ends off with him reading this letter that he received from Kimber, confirming that she actually survived that day on the mountain. She escaped and was able to survive, live on, and then she sent the letter that her mother gave to her after she recovered it from that little plan they had at the funeral. And now that's where we leave at Borrasca 4, and we start with the final part of Borrasca, which is Borrasca 5. So it starts off with reintroducing us to Sam, the new Sam, who is living with a roommate called Seth, who he met in prison because they both were locked up in prison for some pretty gnarly crimes. Seth was in there for cyber crimes, hacking and whatnot, even though he doesn't like to be called a hacker. But Sam was in there for felony possession because he is a big drug addict now. He loves heroin. loves it. He eats it up. And it's while him and Seth are just sitting there that Seth ends up telling him that there was this girl that came over, and he says that it was actually a very attractive girl that came looking for him. And Sam says that it was just a girl probably coming over looking for free drugs that he didn't have anymore because Seth flushed him down the toilet. And then he starts wondering what this girl could want. He says that maybe it's a girl coming over saying that she was pregnant after they hooked up or something. And he says, yeah, you wish. This chick was way beyond anything you could ever get. But then Seth says that he got her number and all this kind of stuff. And then he holds up the sheet of paper and said that she gave it to him and asked to call her when you got home. Because he used the excuse that Sam wasn't home when she came knocking on the door, which obviously this is Kimber if you haven't got that connection yet. He said that he was out because he didn't want to say that he was just on drugs, passed out from heroin. So he said that he was out, and Kimber said to give her a call whenever he was back. And while they were talking, there was a knock on the door, and Seth opened the door to reveal Kimber DeStaro standing on the other side, and Sam says he suddenly felt like a bucket of ice water had been dumped on his soul. And I'm going to skip over Borrasca 5 a bit because it's a whole lot of dialogue, and it's definitely worth reading. You should definitely read this for yourself if you haven't at this point. It's an amazing story. But they get to talking. They kind of say what's going on. Kimber ends up being there because she wants Sam to go back with her to Drisking so she can make everybody atone for their sins. And also get Kyle back because she's been in communication with a contact, which I'll just go ahead and say who it is. She doesn't reveal it till towards the end. It's Jimmy Prescott. That's her contact. She's been in contact with him. Jimmy's saying that he wants to overthrow the current sheriff, get him killed, which is Sam's dad because he stepped up. He's the big dick on campus when it comes to the stables now. He's the one running the operation. And Jimmy Prescott wants him dead so that he can get someone else to take over and not have to take orders from Sam's dad anymore. But Sam does not want to go back with Kimber, and he is pretty much a different person now because of the drugs. It's kind of changed him and the way he acts and all that kind of stuff. But he really doesn't want to go back with Kimber, but Kimber pretty much strong arms him into it, saying that she's going either way, so he decides to, go back with her. And Sam and Kimber have a lot of arguments. They have a lot of disagreements about what's going on, about the plan, and Sam's wanting to protect Kimber constantly this entire time. He wants to be the one to go back and sacrifice himself and kill all the other ones and leave Kimber alive. But Kimber wants her pound of flesh. She wants to get revenge on her rapist, who is turns out to be Sam's dad. And then she also wants to just kill everybody involved and expose the operation for what it truly is and how sickening and terrible it really is. And I'm summarizing and paraphrasing a lot because Borrasca 5 is very long. It's about the length of all the first 4 Borrasca parts put together. But then they go back, they end up going back to Drisking, and they end up staying on a hotel that's on the outskirts of town and trying to prepare, formulate a plan, come up with what they're going to do. And both of them are hiding things from one another. Kimber is hiding who her contact is, Jimmy Prescott, and Sam is hiding what he plans to do, which is leave Kimber behind and go do everything himself so he can save Kimber from potentially dying herself. So what ends up happening is that Sam takes Kimber's car, which is full of guns because she's been training. She's pretty much a badass at this point. She's been working to get revenge for like a decade, so she's pretty prepared to do what they're about to do. But Sam tries to leave her. He goes to visit his old house to maybe see if his mom is in on this, to see if she actually knew what was going on, because he doesn't believe his mom would be in on this. And then he ends up finding out that his mom is dead. She died like right after he left Drisking that decade ago. And the sheriff, his dad, Graham, who he no longer refers to as dad, he only calls him the sheriff or Graham at this point because he doesn't see him as his dad anymore, really. He hates him. He wants to kill him. But his dad is now married to a girl that Sam had a crush on in high school named Emmeline. And Emmeline is complacent. She knows what's going on, and she is very much in on it. And I guess she just loves being in the position of power that she's in, being married to the most powerful man in Drisking, Graham Walker. But also, I forgot to mention, it was right before that happened that Jimmy Prescott came to the hotel they were at and he tased Kimber and knocked her out, and then told Sam what he wanted Sam to do. He wanted Sam to kill his dad so that his dad would be out of the equation, and then he wanted Sam to take his dad's spot so that he didn't have to take orders from Sam's dad anymore. So they go along with this, and Sam says he'll tell Jimmy when he's ready to, go for the kill shot on his dad. So they start setting things up, they start to formulate, and that's whenever Sam tries to go behind Kimber's back and goes to his old house and all that kind of stuff, to which Kimber shows up and ends up knocking out Emmeline. But Emmeline calls the sheriff, and then they send cops there, to which Sam and Kimber now are pretty mad at each other, but they end up trying to find Borrasca so they can just go guns blazing, go out in a blaze of glory, and take everyone down with them. But there's so much snow on the ground that they end up getting chased up a road that is towards Borrasca, or what used to be Borrasca, and it's the only one that's paved. They stop chasing them, the cop cars stop chasing them up there because they know they're stuck up there and they have nowhere else to go. And it's also while they're up here that they practice target shooting. Kimber teaches Sam how to shoot a gun, and they start to try to come up with a plan of what they're going to do. But then they find the devastating discovery that all their guns were stolen. While they were at the hotel, they snuck down there, the cops did, Sam's dad, and stole all the guns, the arsenal that they had in Kimber's car. And all that they left them with was a bulletproof vest, and they only have one bullet left in their gun. And this is the note that was left for them after they found the guns were all missing. They said, "We know all you have on you is one semi-automatic handgun. We're leaving you this ballistic vest to show you that we play fair. Your daddy wants to see you. Come to us before we come to you. Coordinates below. The good guys. P.S. Your vehicle has been low-jacked, courtesy of the Butler County Sheriff's Department." And then that chapter ends saying that they couldn't leave. They were being tracked. They knew exactly where they were. They always had known, and all roads now lead to Borrasca. So now at this point, they're stuck in the car in the freezing cold with little gas left, and they're trying to come up with a plan to take down this whole operation. And then it skips over what their potential plan was, and it just goes straight to Sam walking through the snow in 6 layers of clothing, but frozen to the core. And then he finally meets with his dad. He says, "Hello, Graham." He spat into the snow between us. "You're a goddamn disgrace." And then the sheriff says, "Shut the fuck up. Grig, teach my son some respect." So then he kind of just beats the ever-living shit out of Sam a little bit. Kind of roughs him up a bit. Kind of gives him a 1-2 combo. Gives him a knuckle sandwich. So yeah, that's pretty much what goes on. They start having conversations, telling each other to, they're pieces of shit, saying they hate each other, all that kind of stuff. Oh shit, I forgot a pretty crucial part. Right before this whole big situation, before they went and found out the guns were taken, Sam went through like a 72-hour period. He went cold turkey on the drugs. He quit. He gave it up for Kimber so he could help her, so he could be fully himself for this whole encounter. And he went through hell, going cold turkey with withdrawals and all that. But he was finally sober, and he went into this whole situation here sober, and then got his ass beat by Grig, who has a stupid name, by the way. Grig is a very dumb name, I think. Sorry if your name's Grig. I just think it's like a really dumb way of spelling Greg. But it actually turns out that Sam's dad was the one who was supplying his drugs in the first place. He wanted him to be a drug addict so he would be harmless, because he couldn't even remember the last time that he'd paid for those drugs. They just kept showing up, and he'd let him do that for years. So his dad was fucking him up, and he didn't even know it. And then he ends up asking his dad, "Why did you hurt Whitney?" And then it says the sheriff yanked his gun out of his holster and then crossed his arms in front of him, pointing it at the ground. "The only thing I did to Whitney was avenge her death." And Sam says, "No, you raped her." And then he fucking pistol whipped him. To which Sam says, "Bit of a sore spot." Yeah, maybe you shouldn't be witty while you're getting your ass beat. So to skip over this dialogue, because it's a lot, and like I said, you should just read it yourself, he just keeps aggravating the sheriff more and more, getting on his nerves, hitting him where it hurts, knowing that Whitney is a sore spot, and he keeps talking about stuff like that, getting him more and more enraged, to the point where he's pretty much puffing smoke out of his ears. And then here Sam says that he was his dad, he loved him, and then his dad says, "You don't look like any son of mine," but Sam says, "More importantly, you were a cop, you were supposed to protect people." And Graham says, "No, Sammy, I'm a businessman, always have been, even back then. Why the fuck do you think we came to Drisking in the first place?" So that's when the connections get made, that the reason they got sent there in the first place is because Sam's dad was already doing some shady shit, and they sent him to a place where he could actually fully embrace and fully become a shitty person doing shitty things and getting paid a lot of money for it. So it's pretty much the perfect transfer for Graham Walker. And then he says, I remembered I hadn't understood it at that age, but I knew now what all the whispers had meant because of those girls and the things they said you did. So, yeah, apparently he was doing something kind of similar before he got transferred that caused him to get transferred. And he said, exactly, I was making money, they were getting laid. They were 14. 14's older than you think, Sam. And it's not like I touched them. So, yeah, he was running a big rape empire. It just really shows the true horrors of Sam's dad and how disgusting human beings are capable of being. I've been recording so long, it's getting dark outside now, and there's also so much snow, and it's supposed to snow even more tonight. I just went and ate. That's why there's a weird cut, and it's a lot darker now, but I'm not turning on more lights. It's getting real spooky. But I left off where Sam and his dad Graham were having their little standoff with all his sheriffs. It was like a 1v6 or something, wherever they told him to meet at the coordinates. And then they're arguing back and forth. He says, give me more credit. I'm stronger than you think. And then Graham says, strong enough to take a bullet to the head and live through it. He laughed. And Sam said, are you? Kind of got him there. And then it turns out there was a total of 15 men. He thought there was only initially 13. And then 2 of them came out and said, oi, boss, look what I caught lurking around. And it says they came around from the side of the dorm, pushing a woman in front of them. And he said, Kimber, I gotta cozy back up real quick. But Kimber says, I'm sorry, Sam, they... And then the sheriff says, well, I heard you'd turn into a looker, but I'd yet to confirm it for myself. Hello again, sweetheart. God damn. Especially knowing that he is her rapist. Man, this just makes this whole altercation so much more impactful. Says the sheriff walked over to Kimber and ran his fingers alongside her face. She recoiled at his touch. And then Sam starts screaming, don't you fucking touch her. But then Griggs shoved the gun of a barrel to the back of his head and told him to sit the fuck down. But then they just keep yelling back and forth, typical standoff style, saying, watch your temper. And then Sam keeps saying, stay away from her, you fucking pervert. And then Kimber says, stop, Sam, you'll just be killed. And then it keeps escalating and escalating to a boiling point to where we get to this. Sam says, let Kimber go. Let her go and I'll do anything you want. And he says, oh, really? Anything? Yes. Just let her go. Would you leave here and never come back? Yes. Would you stay here and help me run my business? Yes. Would you go inside right now and fuck one of our girls? Yep. Yes. Please don't call that fucking bluff. No, Sam, Kimber yells. And then he says, Richards, would you shut her the fuck up? And then the sheriff continues and says, now then, how about Phoebe Dranger? If I recall, she was a raging cunt to you in high school. Why don't you go in there and take some vengeance for yourself? I'm sure she'd love it. I don't, she's not really my type. Oh, I guess Kimber DeStaro is more your type, isn't she? No, I said quickly. No, somebody else, anybody else. And then Jimmy chimes out of nowhere and says, what a fucking pussy. And then the sheriff looked at Jimmy annoyingly and said, do I look like I need to be fucking entertained right now? Do I tell my monkey to dance? No, I fucking didn't. So shut the fuck up, monkey. Dude's out here sounding like Frieza talking to Jimmy Prescott. And then after Jimmy Prescott and the sheriff have their dick measuring contest or whatever they was doing, it says the sheriff turned around to give me a disgusted look and shook his head in disappointment. Then, without turning to even look at her, the sheriff shot Kimber in the chest where she stood and she fell over in the snow without making a sound. And then this absolutely broke Sam. Sam started yelling, screaming, throwing a fit, and the sheriff says, oh, quit your yelling. I tried to warn you, Sammy. Jesus Christ, son, the sheriff said in disgust. Enough theatrics. I didn't even act like this when your mother died. You killed her, I screamed at him. You murdered her. And then the sheriff just keeps on with his disgusting dialogue, saying some real heinous shit again, over and over and over again. And then Sam really starts playing it up. He keeps saying, I told her not to come. I told her not to come. Literally just like throwing a tantrum. And then the sheriff says, let him throw his tantrum. He did the same thing when I took away his toys as a kid. This ain't no different. So this really shows you how fucked up in the head Graham Walker is. Seeing someone freaking out over losing potentially one of their best, closest friends, seeing human life being lost as the same as losing a toy, that is how fucked up he is in the head. He doesn't see reality through a compassionate lens. He just sees it as whatever benefits him the most. But then the sheriff says, Richards just had an interesting idea. You're in for a real treat, Sam. Get him up. So then it says they picked him up to his feet in the direction of his father, and then he keeps on going and says, we don't use it too much anymore on account of the noise, But how about we throw your girlfriend's body into the shiny gentleman and scatter her bone fragments all over the mountain? That way she can be here at the mine for all eternity. I bet she'd like that. No, please. Don't beg, he spat. It makes you look weak. Get off your fucking knees. And then he keeps going, and then he starts to agitate him again, trying to get on his nerves by once again bringing up Whitney and says, but Whitney, look what it did to her, this place. And then he says, I ain't gonna warn you again, boy. Keep my daughter's name out your mouth. Which daughter? He asked. Pretty witty for someone about to get the ever-living, literally the life beat out of him. And the sheriff says, what can I say? Whitney is a beautiful name. But then the argument kind of hits a tipping point after Sam says he'll never be a part of this and he'll never stop trying to kill him. Then Graham says, well, I'm sorry to hear that. That's a pity. Looks like we're going to have to break you in like a horse. I kind of wish I'd left the Starro girl alive now. And then Sam says, fuck you. And he spat into the snow. And then Graham says, you say another fucking word like that to me and I'm going to execute you right here on your fucking knees. Saying that the sheriff's men seemed to lean in, smelling blood in the water. I knew this was it. If you wanted me dead, you would have already shot me. You sure about that? The sheriff asked and leveled his gun to my forehead. Why don't you pull that gun on me and find out? Oh, I'm sure about that. You need me. Through the sea of bullshit, I see the truth. It's a pride thing. You want your son taking over your business. You want another Walker in charge. Sheriff's mouth spread into a wide smile, but he didn't lower his gun. I can make another son. You could. But you want me. You want to break me. You want to mold me into you, because that way you win. Oh, I've already won, Sam. No, I have. You're a slave to your own fucking hubris. I can say and do whatever I want, and your pride won't allow you to kill me. Maybe not, the sheriff shrugged, as he dropped the barrel of gun to his chest. But I can break your ribs with a fucking bullet. And then he shot Sam, who he assumed had the bulletproof vest on, but it turns out he didn't. He even says, hurts like a fucking bitch, doesn't it? A shot to a ballistics vest hurts a hell of a lot more than a kick with a steel-toed boot. But of course, your ribs are already broken, so that must really sting. And then Sam says he knew he was going into shock. He pulled his hands away from his jacket and saw that they were covered in warm, thick blood. The laughing died immediately, and the sheriff took a step in his direction, saying, what the hell? And Sam said, fuck you. And by that time, Kimber was standing up from where they'd left her discarded in the snow. They thought she was dead. They thought she was gone. But it turns out her and Sam actually formulated a plan that was actually, super baller. I can't believe I just said fucking baller. A really good plan of how they were going to take them down. But before I explain the whole plan to you, Kimber stood up from where she was laying in the snow, aimed the gun at the sheriff, squeezed the trigger, and killed her monster. And now, the plan, obviously, if you didn't understand it from what was just said there, Sam and Kimber intended everything that happened to happen. They both wanted to be in that situation. They wanted Kimber to get caught. They wanted Sam not to get shot, but to work up the sheriff, to get him really heated, to not think super clearly, to where he would act on emotion and whatnot. But he did end up getting shot, so that wasn't part of the plan, because he knew that his dad would think he had the vest on, and they wanted him to think that Kimber got caught by mistake. And after the sheriff got shot, all the men that were loyal to him pulled out their guns on Sam and Kimber, but then Jimmy took control of the situation and actually came through on his promise, and he told them to lower their guns, pretty much. And Jimmy gives Sam a little pat on the back, saying that he can't believe he did something that crazy, talking that much shit to the sheriff, being completely unarmed without even a bulletproof vest on. Which, I gotta say, does take some big old cojones. And then, of course, Jimmy Prescott would probably have killed both of them after this, just, cover up the loose ends. But they had a contingency plan to also deal with Jimmy Prescott. And it says that he pulled a small remote control and dropped it in the snow in front of him. And Jimmy laughed, saying, what the fuck is that? And he said, it's a remote for the video cameras. And he says, what the fuck are you talking about, kid? What video cameras? For the first time, and it says, for the first time since Sam had met him, Jimmy looked rattled. And he says, those video cameras. And he pointed up to the trees where a dozen small cameras blended into the dark branches, their blinking red lights all but invisible. And then he raised the gun to Sam's face, but seemed a little bit conflicted about the camera situation. And he said if he believed him about the cameras, he knew he couldn't shoot him. It all came down to his ability to bullshit yet again. This whole plan pretty much relies on a lot of bullshit. And then Jimmy says, I'll just take those cameras down and break them like they were never there. And then Sam says, they're on a live feed, asshole. Fuck, Jimmy shouted. Fuck you. The video is streaming back to a laptop in Chicago. It's over. And then that was the moment where all the men who were around Jimmy, the 15 total men or whatever, scattered like roaches to all sides of the camp, getting in their trucks and speeding off the mountain to get as far away from this situation and save their asses as they possibly could. And Jimmy was already on the phone with someone as he was digging for the keys in his pocket. He said, delete it, all of it, get it off the DHS internet, and make sure it's gone for fucking ever. I don't give a shit where you are. We need the database gone now. Like it never fucking existed. No, fuck the fucking backups, delete it all. And then it says Jimmy threw his phone on the ground and shot it 4 times with his gun, ran to a truck, and ripped the door open. So it seems like he bought the bullshit. And I forgot to tell you too that while they were doing this, Seth had came to Drisking to help assist them, and it turns out he was pretty crucial, like very key component in this little situation, them busting this whole terrible human trafficking ring. So he calls Seth while he's laying there bleeding out and says, it worked. She's alive. I'm alive. The high school. Those sick fuckers host all the records on the school servers, Drisking High. So he says, Drisking High. Got it. And he says, I'm working on it. That database is going to be locked down, secure as fuck. But like I said the other day, I'm pretty good at what I do. I don't know what the file will be called, Sam said. And then he dropped the phone next to him where it's stuck in the snow and faded out for a few minutes, trying to hold on. And he heard Seth say, I got it. I just looked for the most buried shit on the server. They're scrubbing it fast, man, but I got it. They definitely know I'm here, though. But then, after all that, we find out that Sam wakes up in the hospital. And then he wakes up asking where he is, and they say he's at Drisking Regional, and that they're going to give him some morphine, but then Sam says, no morphine, please, take me off it. Which is obviously because of his drug addiction. He doesn't want to go back down that rabbit hole. He's went through enough. He's killed all his demons. He's fought all his monsters and slayed them all, him and Kimber both. And now the only thing left on their checklist is to get Kyle and see if he's actually in a vegetative state or if he's just being sedated like Jimmy told them that he was. Because ever since that day that they said Sam nearly beat Kyle to death, he's been in a vegetative state, and they were keeping him at his own home, at the Landy home, but then they ended up transferring him and moving him somewhere while Sam and Kimber were both out of Drisking for that, decade. But naturally, after Sam wakes up, he starts asking where Kimber is. They say she's fine, she's doing all right, and he asks also how he's not dead, and they say that he owes it to a rather skilled surgeon on the staff at the hospital. And then the 2 detectives that have been trying to, question him for the past couple days come in, and he starts talking to them, and he asks where Kimber is. They say she's in federal custody, giving her own statement, and then they also inform him after he asks about what happens with the women at the mines, and they say the victims have all been removed from the scene, and they say that an internal investigation has been opened due to the sensitive information that was leaked by the press on Wednesday evening, which was his friend Seth leaking the press packet of all the information about the stables. And then at the end of chapter 19 here, they say, do you mind if we record you? And then he says, fuck no, I want this all on record. And then they say, all right, tell us about your father. And then chapter 20, which is the last chapter of Borrasca, starts with Sam standing outside of on the tarmac of Drisking Small Airport that he says was old, crumbling, and abandoned. And he was standing there waiting on Kimber because they promised that she would be there within the hour. And he was waiting in the cold, nervously smoking a cigarette, waiting outside of a giant tent. And they said the reason that Kimber was being held longer was because she admitted to killing a law enforcement officer, that being Sam's dad, and Grant said the prosecutor would almost certainly decline the press charges due to the circumstances rapidly coming to light. And then Kimber finally shows up. She says Sam as she screams his name and runs towards him, wrapping her arms around him and giving him a big old bear hug, and forgetting that he got shot as he, winces in pain. And then they give them the keys to a Ford Explorer that they say they can take to leave. They say don't leave town and don't talk to the media and don't talk to anybody, as a matter of fact. And then while they're in the car, they get to talking, and Kimber ends up asking how many women ended up being at Borrasca. And he says 132. But that wasn't the number that were there at one time. That was just the overall number of women throughout the whole operation. And while they're driving, Sam is giving Kimber directions, but it doesn't really say where they're going. And it turns out that where they were going the entire time was to the place where Kyle was being held this entire time, which was house number 445. And he says it's a group home, and Kimber laughs and says, "A group home? What for?" And they didn't say anything, and Kimber finally came to the realization. She says, "I don't, you mean?" But Jimmy said, "I heard him." And then he says, "Well, contrary to Jimmy Prescott's last words to me, I don't believe everything he says." The Landys left town with just about everybody else 2 days ago. According to Grant, they didn't take their oldest son with them, just Parker. So yeah, also after the whole thing got exposed, the whole operation, everyone fled Drisking because most people were involved. Most people were involved in that situation, so they all, got the hell out of Dodge. But then they make their way into this group home. They ask about Kyle and all that, and then they go to his room. They're walking there, all the while anticipating, just crossing their fingers, hoping for the best. But right before they got to the open doorway of Kyle's room, Kimber stops and starts shaking her head and says, "I can't. I just can't, Sam." And then Sam gave her a hug, told her it's going to be fine, and then they finally prepared themselves mentally for a few moments to walk into Kyle's room, where they saw Kyle in a wheelchair, and he says he was facing the bed, staring straight ahead at the swirling oak of the wall in front of him. He didn't react to their voices or move in the slightest. They weren't even sure that he was blinking, and he remembered Kimber walking slowly into the room. He sat down on the edge of the bed in front of Kyle to study him. His injuries had all healed, other than his nose, which remained out of place and broken. He was wearing flannel pants and a nondescript white t-shirt and socks. His hair was long and a red beard covered the bottom half of his face. His eyes were fixed over my shoulder, lazily settled on the wall behind me. "Kyle," I said as I moved in his line of vision. "It's Sam." And it says he blinked, but his eyes tried to focus and they didn't follow him, and they didn't really show any signs of Kyle being there. To which he started begging, saying, "Kyle, please fucking tell me you're in there." But it says his eyes just glazed over and he knew that what remained of Kyle was only the barest of brain functions. To which he just screamed, "Fuck." And then Kimber was crying. She started sobbing and said, "Stop, Sam, stop." And it was just getting super emotional, super heavy. And then he says he stood up from the bed, walked over the window to watch the snow fall outside. A new powder to cover this place. We'd come so far, but not far enough. We'd won in almost every conceivable way on the barest of odds, but it still wasn't enough. I wanted Kyle back. I wanted to be whole. And then he says he heard Kimber leave the doorway and turned to watch her sit in front of Kyle. She took his limp hands into hers and held them while she softly told him that she had missed him and that she loved him. Then she laid her head on his lap and continued to whisper to Kyle through her tears. I turned back to watch the snow fall. And then I heard a voice that hadn't spoken since the day it had told Jimmy Prescott to go fuck himself 10 years before on the now silent mountain. Kimber. And that is how Borrasca ends, with presumably Kyle coming back to his senses, coming back to himself, and realizing that Kimber was there. And I gotta say, this isn't a fairy tale happy ending, but it's an upbeat ending for such a downbeat story, Something good actually came out of this depressing ass story, that being our main three characters, our main three protagonists, made it out on the other side as good as they could. I was going to say scot-free, but no, they went through some heavy shit. But they came out on the other side victorious, overcoming the slimmest of odds. And that is hopefully a good walkthrough of this whole thing. Just really wanted to talk about it. I loved this story. I listened to it from Mr. Creepypasta about like 3 or 4 years ago, and then I re-listened to it about a week ago. I also listened to the audio drama version, which is a little bit different. I really like the whole parole officer thing they added in there. But other than that, that's pretty much it. I hope I covered everything. I hope I made it enjoyable, interesting, and brought you something that you could enjoy as much as I did. But other than that, I will catch you in the next one.